Hello everybody, welcome to World History. Today I'm finally going to end my lessons on the French Revolution. And you might be thinking something like, Mr. Westerhoff, why have we talked about this so much? We've had like weeks and weeks on just the French Revolution. Doesn't this only matter to like the country of France? Well, no, the French Revolution had very long lasting impact on the entire world. And today I'm going to go into why. But let's talk about kind of the nadir, the lowest point of the French Revolution first before we get there. And it's a famous time period in France known as the Reign of Terror. So let's get into it. Before we do that, let's just remember the difference in all these kinds of French governments that had existed up to this point. So remember, the Estates General was in 1789. That was the meeting of the three estates, and that was the old regime. Then we had the National Assembly, which was the interim government run by the Third Estate after the fall of the old regime. So that lasted 3 years. Then in 1792, we have the Legislative Assembly, which was created in the first French Constitution, which was a constitutional monarchy. This is before the king tried to escape, and once he did and the more radical elements of the French Revolution took over, we had the National Convention, which lasted from 1792 to 1795. That was the new constitution created to be a more radical republic with no monarchy. So now we know the difference between all those, because I know there's a lot of use of the words assembly and convention and which one is which, like who's actually ruling France. Well, today, in today's story, we're going to be talking about the convention. So let's talk about the problems of war. So remember, we kind of ended the last lesson with saying that a lot of people in France had actually gone to war, that there were other countries who started to invade France because they were afraid of the revolution spreading to their country, and they wanted to keep the monarchy in power. So the French army actually had to organize itself and kind of run itself, because the government was in such shambles and disarray at the time. So what will end up happening is that the French military becomes kind of this bastion of strength and organization, while the government's in shambles. But meanwhile, the problems of war, just like during most wars throughout history, it leads to food shortages and rising prices. And the clergy, the church, refused to swear loyalty to the revolution. And we have, elements of a counter-revolution, where some people like the old system better and were fighting against the revolution. And this really freaks out the people who were in charge at the time, the National Convention, run by this guy, Maximilien Robespierre, who will become very important to our story. He was part of the Jacobins, who were the most left-leaning elements, the most radical elements of the old Legislative Assembly, now the National Convention. Basically believed in no monarchy and kind of, taking away the past, and let's just focus on a government run by Enlightenment values. It's this guy here, his name's Maximilien Robespierre. So what ends up happening with Robespierre in charge? Well, we have what's known as the Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794, most famously known by the symbol of the Reign of Terror, which is the guillotine. During the Reign of Terror, we had swift trials and executions. Basically, anyone opposed to the convention and its values, anyone who seemed to be going against the revolution, who wanted the old system to return, was executed. And this, basically, a lot of these trials were not even serious. Basically, anyone who had any leanings at all towards, thinking like, hey, this system that we have now is kind of crazy, were executed for having that belief. And a lot of people were falsely accused as well. Sometimes people would get into a dispute with their neighbor about, land or farm, or, it's like your animals grazed on my land, or you picked some of my crops. And instead they would think, I'm just going to report them to the authorities and say that they're against the revolution, and they would be executed. Things like that were very common during the Reign of Terror. What made it terrible, what made, a sense of grief palpable, was just the fact that so many people were being executed so quickly just for speaking their minds at all, which is interesting because remember, this was supposed to be about the Enlightenment with freedom of speech and, freedom of expression being important. And meanwhile, freedom of speech is being suppressed here by the National Convention and, their Orwellian named Committee for Public Safety. So just pretty crazy stuff happening. 20,000 people. If you do the math, that's tons of people being executed every single day in Paris, so that's what made it such a scary time to be around. This only ended after Robespierre himself was executed on the guillotine, because other people in the convention thought, he had gone way too far. So, very ironic that the person who kind of started this whole reign of terror by executing people himself gets executed. The work of the National Convention. We don't have a ton of time to talk about this, but during the rule of the National Convention, a lot of things changed in France. They did some positive things and some not so positive things. They provided for a national system of public education. They believed that was important to make sure everyone was educated. They also abolished slavery. So they abolished slavery, almost 70 years before the United States did. They adopted things like the metric system and, having universal weights and measures based on the decimal 10. And they even tried to do this with their calendars, but that didn't work so well. Imagine having a 10-hour day with each hour lasting like 100 minutes. That was basically what they tried to do. It didn't really work very well. People like the old calendar more. They also started things like a cult of reason and tried to wipe away any church influence. A lot of old cathedrals and churches were transitioned into these kind of secular meeting places where they would talk about like Enlightenment values and all that. They tried to kind of erase God from the equation. So that was kind of the work of the National Convention as well. They were trying to totally take down the past and anything that had really made the old regime possible, and they thought religion was a part of that. So they ended up kind of having their own, I wouldn't say atheistic religions, but it was almost like that, and they were called cults of reason. So they were really extreme in trying to wipe away past influence and try to be enlightened to this new, reality. But we see that, trying to do that led to all these terrible executions. The Directory is the last government we'll talk about that kind of ruled France for 5 years. They had this idea that after the fall of the National Convention and all that craziness with Robespierre, let's have a new system where we have, 5 directors. So imagine having 5 presidents. And that was basically the idea behind it. Remember, this is the 3rd constitution in 5 years, so they're not doing so hot when it comes to inventing these new governments that people can vote for. So compared to the United States, it's we had the one constitutional convention and we still have it. France had to write a lot of different constitutions and each one ended up failing. Unfortunately, the 5 directors turned out to be weak, selfish, and corrupt. And once again, prices of food keep going up and the poor are suffering. So not a lot of the original complaints issued against the king in 1789 are really being addressed still. And it's going to take somebody else to kind of fix all these problems. So who is it? Well, it turns out to be this guy. He's pretty famous. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte. What do we know? And this is where you guys would write stuff on the board about what we think about Napoleon and things we've heard about him. Characteristics about him. He was a general at the age of 26. That's really young. He was ambitious and domineering. He was a very good organizer, and he was a military genius. He was somebody who's very good at organization. He also really idolized the old Roman Empire and especially Julius Caesar. So he was kind of a history fanboy. So, and he used a lot of those ideas that he had read about to really help him in his military career. He thought that, being a good military commander would make you very good at ruling a country. So he had very high ambitions, and this will lead him to taking over France. He was pretty dominant in what will be called the Napoleonic Wars, which are named after him. And he continually sought new conquests. When he ends up taking control of France, he kind of organizes the whole country to help him start taking over countries around them. So what happens? Why does Napoleon take over? Conditions were really bad in France around 1799. That's the year we're going to talk about. People actually asked Napoleon to take power. Basically, it's this whole argument between security versus liberty. So do we want a government that has a lot of freedom, including like the freedom to, you know, including like, let's see, it's the best way of phrasing this, the freedom to mess up, I should say. There's always this dance between liberty versus order, and we'll talk about it more and more. And this is a huge theme that will dominate American politics too, and that's kind of the way I'm thinking about it. But it can also be used in other contexts as well. For example, let's think about China for a second. For all of you who like the Mr. Westerhoff, what's he going to talk about today game, you can check China off your list there. Let's think about China for a second. So their government right now is a communist government run by the Communist Party of China, the CCP. And basically, what the party says goes. But the reason this system is in power today is because China went through a long period of chaos and political instability that the communists took over, and they wanted to establish order. And order became more important than people's freedom, and security becomes more important than, people's freedom. So that's it's one of those things where it's like, if you have people with a lot of freedom, it's, of course, we think of that as a good thing, but then you also give people the freedom to do stupid stuff. And that's what ends up happening a lot through history as well. This is a very complicated topic, and might be going a little bit off topic too when it comes to this whole idea, but every government needs to have a mixture of both stability and order and freedom for the people, because you don't want, a police state where everything you do is being monitored, in which case it's very secure, but then, too much absolute freedom means it's basically anarchy and there's no rules and people can just do whatever they want and, kill each other with no consequences. So you want a government that still has a core to it of laws, but you also don't want to completely have it dominate and take over people's lives. However, the conditions in France were so chaotic for a long time that people really wanted that stability after all the chaos, much like what happened in China in the 1950s and 60s. So what is a coup d'etat? That's that fancy word I have there in French. It's a seizure of power by force, and that's what Napoleon ended up doing. He ended up marching the army and just saying, hey, I'm in charge now. The directory, no more. Like, I'm basically in charge now. And he gave himself the title of First Consul, which kind of harkened back to the Roman Empire, which he was such a fan of. And eventually, after a few years, he just kind of drops the pretenses and just declares himself emperor. A quote from Napoleon is, "I found the crown of France lying on the ground, and I picked it up with a sword." The Napoleonic era. So we aren't going to be going through the entirety of the Napoleonic Wars, although it is an interesting point in history. It would also take me quite a long time to talk about, and we just don't have the time for it. France accepted Napoleon as a dictator. Why? Well, I just went into it. Basically, they wanted security. That was the main thing. Napoleon actually respected the Declaration of Rights of Man. He also kept feudalism out of France. So a lot of these old ideas were being pushed out, and a lot of kind of the ideas that were pushed in the Declaration of Rights of Man, of liberty and fraternity, were basically put up to the forefront again. Even though people couldn't elect their leaders like they could in the United States. They had Napoleon as a military dictator. Things did improve in some ways. However, things did not improve for women. Women's rights actually kind of were rescinded and rolled back from what they were during the height of the revolution. So that's one way in which things kind of went backwards. Napoleon's accomplishments. He codified laws across France. He made it so there was a very easy to understand law code that could be enforced everywhere. He planned public education, one of the first examples of this in the Western world. He also kept religious tolerance. This was important because there was intolerance towards religion before. We were talking about the cult of reason and things like that. He brought back and said, you guys can follow any religion you want. You can be Protestant or Catholic. There's tolerance towards different religions during Napoleon's reign. By 1801, there was peace, a firm and steady government, and economic prosperity. So with Napoleon in control, things definitely did improve in France for most people. It depends from what context you're taking that. It did not improve for the lives of women, for example, but economically things were better. He also kept his job as a general and invaded many other European countries. So the French army is considered one of the best in the world, is going to continue trying to expand the empire of France. So we've gone from countries invading France because it seems weak to France invading other countries because they are strong. And this happens only in the course of 10 years. French influence, and this is really the important part of the French Revolution, because after Napoleon is put into charge, what is happening is that he's going to invade these other countries. It's actually going to lead to a lot of interesting side effects. The Napoleonic Code went into effect wherever they invaded. There's also the abolition of serfdom and feudalism. If Napoleon entered into the French army, it entered into another European country. And if anyone was still using the feudal system where serfs and peasants were working for a local lord and in exchange for security, that whole system was abolished wherever the French army went. And those were kind of the last vestiges of the medieval era. So these are being wiped away clean, and we're really getting into the era of the modern nation state as we know it today. He also introduced modern methods of warfare. Of course, this is back in the early 1800s, so we still have things like muskets and single fire, and we have, you have to, of course you have these cannons and you have to prepare quite a lot and reload very slowly. But this was definitely, he definitely modernized a lot of the world's armies when it came to using weapons, especially guns and, cavalry charges and things like that. What was nationalism? Nationalism is, people's love for their country. And he actually inspired nationalism where he went because people hated the French and wanted them to get kicked out. So what was interesting, if not kind of funny, is that all these little principalities and small kind of kingdoms would somewhat times band together in their mutual hatred of the French. So he actually inspired a lot of nationalism as well. And this is where the ideals of the French Revolution also get spread. I have this little picture here, which is a lot of people following somebody off the cliff when it comes to nationalism. Because too much nationalism in your country can really lead to a lot of problems, as you will learn throughout our time here at school. To make a very, very long story short, don't invade Russia in the winter. Napoleon tries to do this in 1812, and his army suffers a pretty terrible defeat. And eventually the other European nations band together and defeat him in Waterloo, which is in Belgium, in 1815, and that is the end of Napoleon's rule of France. So 1815. So he went 16 years of ruling France. Long-term effects of the revolution with this famous painting, which is Liberty leading the people. It spread Enlightenment ideals. Basically, these are the long-term effects of the French Revolution that really changed the world, to go back to what I started with. The important things about the revolution is that it spread Enlightenment ideals. So the idea is that freedom of speech and freedom of religion are important, that the government can't tell you what to believe or what to say. That is actually an important right of people. And it also lessened the powers of monarchs forever. The people who tend to be in charge after the French Revolution are either elected or they kind of seize power by force in a dictator style government. But the power of monarchs and kings and these long-standing dynasties are nowhere near as strong as they used to be. So this is kind of, the end of that era of history as well. An important idea that really gets spread is that a nation is made up of citizens who can elect or choose their leaders, as opposed to subjects of a king who have to just listen to whatever the king or queen says. And then finally, there's this idea that all humans have rights. The idea of human rights will become very, very important in the centuries to come. But we have to remember that the idea of human rights had to be invented and that it is not universal. The idea that, human rights is important is somewhat of a new idea, which is kind of crazy to think about because it's so intrinsic to kind of the way the modern world works and the fact that we have courts and, systems where we kind of appreciate the value of all people. That did not used to exist. And this is also kind of what leads to the end of slavery, or institutionalized slavery in a lot of countries, is this idea that we should appreciate the inherent worth in all people. So that's something that really spread with the revolution as well. So when we think about the revolution, we can think of it as a failure because the original idealism of 1789 with kind of taking down the monarchy and having a representative style of government that accepted everybody's value did not happen. Instead, we had, things like the Reign of Terror, and we had Napoleon as a dictator taking over, but there were some important things that were spread as well. So that's why the French Revolution is so important, because it tells us kind of the value of Enlightenment thinking, and also a lot of the dangers that come with Enlightenment, with the Enlightenment as well. So it's a very complicated story, but hopefully you guys enjoyed learning about it more. I certainly did. I had to go over this entire period of history with a fine-tooth comb because when I was in high school, I didn't learn about it in as much detail as we did this year. So I enjoyed doing the research to teach about it as well. So hopefully you enjoyed learning about it. And we just, in world history class, we're just going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution, and then that will be the end of our school year. So thank you guys for joining me, and I will see you next time. Thank you, everyone.